Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're going to be starting on a really fun build here. So I just recently finished the LS Mail Jeep, and now I'm going to be moving on to the Canadian Post Jeep. So I'm going to send this body to Matt Kett from Skill Builders Guild, and I'm really excited to get this thing started. So let's just get to it. Many of the designs for this build were a carryover from the LS Mail Jeep. This is the rear cargo cover, and the shape is the same, but the design is different. For the LS Post Jeep, I went with the SBG logo, maple leaf, and hockey stick. This design was drawn up and sent to my Cricut machine. The machine can cut up to 20 thousandths inch thick styrene. I cut several of these so they can be glued together for a piece that's around 60 thousandths thick. Some of the letters, like the B, don't have the center portions, but I think it looks okay, and it's much more durable than if I try to leave them with tiny sections for attachment points. The next step is to cut out the side panel. This is just cut from a flat sheet of 60 thousandths styrene. I have learned that much better corners can be achieved by grinding the material away. In the past, I have tried the score and break method. The problem is it can cause weird breaks that just require materials to be added later. The flat panels are attached to the back section, which comes from a vacuum formed piece. To make solid attachment points, thin strips are glued along the edges. Once I have all the strips attached and sanded back, it's offered up to the back panel and solvent glued in place. CA glue is used to help hold the joint secure, while the solvent glue has a chance to flash off and cure. The roof section is another piece that comes directly from the original Jeep. The mold is made out of MDF and styrene pieces, are glued and sanded down to give it the appearance of a ribbed roof. Having that ribbing adds a lot of strength to the roof and prevents the need of any additional bracing. There's a drip rail that runs around the entire roof. Instead of making a thin strip, I place a large sheet which spans the entire roof. Once glued in place, I'm able to cut out the center section. This not only keeps the strength while gluing, but cutting back a piece after installing is far more accurate than if I tried to cut it exactly beforehand. I'm a huge fan of this Proxxon rotary tool. At some point soon, I want to get their micro sander tool as well. Much like the rear cargo cover, I used a Cricut to cut out the letters for the tailgate. This is just kept at the 20 thousandths thick. I also used the scrap material to mark up on the rear for placing the letters. When I mold the parts, things like windows and doors are left intact. I just cut a small trench into the mold to get a solid cut line. For the rear, I didn't do this since the cutouts are square and easily marked up afterwards. The door area is cut out and a separate piece is placed on top to represent the door. The side pieces have armor plating that covers the fenders and wraps around the back. It runs right up to the door. What I did was make a mold so the entire section can be glued on in one piece. Eventually, it will have a 3D printed bolts installed to represent how it's attached. The bottom piece, which makes up for the floor, really ties in the thin sections and adds that needed strength. It looks really good, but becomes a nightmare later on when trying to fit in the roll cage. There are pieces glued onto the floor section, which represent the wings or the small fenders for the front. These are also given an area where the window valance can be glued in place. This is a vacuum formed piece which gives it that nicely rounded curve. Just like the rear panels, when I attach panels with a butt joint, I add a backer of styrene to add strength. This is the point when things start to speed up. Since this is a rebuild of an existing body, there's little to no design work. It's just making and gluing panels together. The front grille of a DJ5 is unique due to its extended shape. A similar Jeep would have a much flatter grille. The styrene pulls into the slots very well, but it leaves a very thin strip between the slots. A piece of styrene square rod was glued between each slot before sanding back. It's a bit thicker than the real one, but will be much sturdier. Some of my first attempts had me cutting the front window out prior to gluing in place. This will work, but the likelihood of breaking is pretty high. The front windshield is pretty easy for this, since it's just a flat piece with one simple bend. Even the windows are simple, since the vehicle doesn't run windows at all. There are small sections on the side which need to be placed on the Jeep. These tie into the windshield and roof as well. A lot of the pieces around the windshield and roof are left long. This gives us a chance to cut back exactly to where it's needed. So the original Postal Jeep had this giant door which slides on a track, kind of similar to a barn door. The track was left on the original, so I replicated it on this one just using some angles pieces of styrene. I also glued in some thin quarter round to bulk out the rain gutter. It's pretty finicky work, but if you go slow and are careful, you will only glue your fingers to the Jeep half a dozen times or so. The Jeep hood has an aluminum plate with louvers cut in. I believe this was to cover up a hole from a previous design for the engine. I created a design that allows thin pieces of aluminum to be formed into shape. The flat fender look is replicated using the thin steel wire and styrene. To make the metal fender section, I just set up my bender and work with some thin material I have in my metal spin. One end is slotted into a hole, and the other has a small tab soldered on which gets bolted to the grill. The bottom of the body is protected with some aluminum channel. This slips over the bottom and is cut back to match the sections of the body panels. This piece can also be attached to the body, depending on which chassis is used. The rear taillights are round axial lenses, and they are set into these large pieces of styrene. This gives a good structure that is perfectly round, but also adds a little protrusion which gives dimensionality to the taillight. The first step is to take the tubing and apply silver solder into the end. This is then drilled out to allow an M3 tap to be used. The tapped holes allow me to screw it solidly to a piece of thin plywood. Once I have the two main hoops mounted, it's just a matter of cutting and soldering in cross braces. A few years ago, I found these round LED lights in an automotive store. They have an aluminum waterproof case and can be run directly on a 3S battery. The size is perfect for so many builds which use round headlights. However, the best part is they are some of the brightest lights I have ever used. The headlight opening is close, but extra material is left so it can be sanded back for a very tight fit. The lights get mounted to an aluminum angle piece using the double-sided tape which comes on the lights. This will allow the entire package to be removed and placed back in the same way every time. This package is screwed to some thicker styrene glued to the hood. So the real LS Mail Jeep has seat risers, which are attached directly to the roll cage. For the scaled down version, I decided that styrene boxes were a much better choice. Much easier to mount this to the seat, but once painted, it will still have that look. Small details like hinges can be made by gluing solid styrene rod. Then I go back and cut notches to represent the joints in the hinge. Once painted, it really looks the part. The same idea is used for the hood hinges, but they're much shorter and a little bit different shape. The side of the Jeep has these air intakes. When I made the original one, the shapes were cut out of thin styrene and glued together. A small piece of screen was glued between the layers to give it the right look. The end result was great, but for this I wanted to speed up the process. So I drew these shapes up and imported them into the Cricut design space. This allowed me to cut these same shapes out of styrene, but with a lot less effort. Once the piece was made, I just needed to cut a hole in the side and install it in the Jeep. I wanted the layout of the dash to be the same between both builds, but I wanted the graphics and color scheme to be a little different. I just take a piece of styrene and add in some 3D printed parts before making mounting locations on the roll cage for the dash. I'm pretty sure the build will be on the top of a VS410, but it's hard to make such a tight-fitting piece, such as a transmission cover, without having it in hand. This is why I made the transmission cover removable. Worst case, Matt will just need to build a new shape, but hopefully it will just work fine the first time. I tried to carry this same idea through the entire build. All the main pieces are screwed in place versus gluing. This will allow modification by Matt if needed. Up until now, most of the build is very similar to the LS Mail Jeep, but this is where the LS Post Jeep is born. It starts with blacking out the underside. Next up is making a template to mark up where to lay down the paint lines. I did my best to pick a red and blue that matches the Canadian Post logo. Here is where I am spraying it down on the Jeep body. There are always a lot of small pieces which need to be hand painted. This starts with the taillights and then moves to the dash components. I do my best to get the details on these tiny pieces. It's always harder doing this through a camera, but my 2.5 magnifying glasses really helps out a lot. For the gauges, I am using 3D printed rings with stickers placed in them. These rings have a small 1mm tab, which helps get them aligned properly before applying the gauge stickers. I want to start getting gauges designed for my resin printer, but that is something I'll have to get to eventually. So I've been calling this the LS Post Jeep, but until the day before I made these stickers, I still hadn't had that name finalized. I wanted to replicate the LS Mail Jeep, but doing it in a Canadian fashion. I think I really pulled it off, eh? Many of the stickers were the same as LS Mail Jeep, but just made in different colors. In the original Jeep, the armor plating down the side is bolted on. So I want to represent that with these 3D printed bolts. And I install them in appropriate locations according to the original Jeep. A simple 3D printed radiator was installed onto the headlight assembly. The radiator can only be seen slightly, but does a good job of blocking the headlight assembly from view. The seatbelts I'm using here look absolutely amazing, but are one of the most frustrating things to put together. All the components are metal and have to be popped out before assembly. Each piece of fabric gets wound through the brackets and eventually they all get bolted together in the middle. Once you get the hang of the process, it does speed up, but the first few are definitely a struggle. Since the battery box is so tightly shaped to the chassis, I had to leave this chore to Matt. Hey, you're welcome. This piece is a cover and swings out of the way using loosely tied zip ties. As mentioned, this is crafted from layers of thin cut styrene off my Cricut machine. It's always a fun time using 220 grit sandpaper on a freshly painted body. I did this on the hood, so when I glued the aluminum louver piece down, it would have a good tooth for the glue to grab. Once all else is complete, I can add in the dash. This is attached to the cage using scale hardware. This build has been an absolute blast to build. I am so honored to have one of my trucks going to the Scale Builders Guild headquarters. I look forward to seeing what Matt does with this and can't wait for a running video. There are a few builds which have really gotten me excited, so I'm looking forward to getting to them. Until then, we'll see you in the rocks.